Hello, fellow travelers. Welcome back to the Pilari Presents South Africa podcast, which is a podcast that follows my tour of South Africa as a local, and it particularly focuses on cultural heritage tourism in the country. In today's episode, we are focusing on the Lydenburg Heads at the Lydenburg Museum. But before we continue with today's topic, I just want to make a disclaimer that I'm having technical issues, and so I'm using a different type of microphone. The microphone that I'm used to using is just decided not to show up, for work. It decided that today is not the day in which it will be recording. And so, what I'm doing right now is that I am using my iPhone headsets as a microphone. And so, if you notice that the sound quality of this episode is different from the others that I have previously uploaded, well, that's because I am going about this differently. I'm using different means of producing this episode. Another disclaimer that I want to address. Oh, yeah. Um, or another disclaimer that I want to make is that last week I mentioned that this week is travel week, the SA travel week. And yes, that is happening. And I went online and I saw a lot of deals, right? Um, but I also noticed that it seems like some companies are taking advantage of this. They are taking advantage of travelers who want to use this time to travel in a much more affordable way. So I had suspicions because, I've before travel week essay, I generally do look at what other things I can do, and I note down their prices. And I noticed that there are certain companies that pretend that they are giving half price when actually they are not. The price that they're putting as the original price is not their actual original price. For example, there's a company that's making 50 Rand more during this travel week um, that than what it usually does or what it usually makes with its original price. Um, so I just want to caution you guys that as you're doing this, because we still have a few more days left in this week, in this travel week, um, please just do a comparative study before you make a purchase or you make a deal. Just compare the original prices with the discounted prices. That means go directly to the website of the company that is providing, a discount on Short-Lived's website. But I trust that I have a smart group of listeners who are doing that, even though I haven't mentioned it in the previous episode, that there are a great deal of listeners who are making their own homework, their own research, and double checking the information that I provide. So let's get into this week's um, topic, which is the Lydenburg Heads at the Lydenburg Museum. So, the Lydenburg Museum is a small museum that is located in Lydenburg, which is a small town that is in Mpumalanga, which in English could be said it is where the place where the sun rises, or the place of the rising sun, right? That's what Mpumalanga means, and it is in the Ehlanzeni region of the province of the Mpumalanga province. Another name that Lydenburg goes by is Mashishing. So if you listen to this podcast and afterwards you're like, I want to go see these heads that Pilates talking about, and then you decide to drive up to Lydenburg, but then when you are driving, you see road signs that write Mashishing instead of Lydenburg, please note that you're not lost. You're still going to the correct place. It's just that the road signs do interchange between these two names. Um, so yeah, the Lydenburg Heads can be found at the Lydenburg Museum in Mpumalanga, in this town called Lydenburg/Mashishing. And how I came to know about the Lydenburg Heads is that in December of 2019, I was moving out of my apartment in Cape Town, and I was moving back home, right? Because I had done all of my master's classes. I had nothing left for me, or I had no reason to stay in Cape Town. So I packed everything and I was moving back home. And so me and my father decided to make a road trip out of this. So instead of driving directly from Cape Town up to Gauteng, we decided to zigzag across the country and view different attractions in the country. Sorry, that is a paper that fell off my lap. If you heard that. um. So as we're traveling, we decided to buy a map, and so on this map tends to identify certain attractions that one can visit along certain routes. And so one of these attractions was the Lydenburg Heads. I saw like a picture of these weird looking heads on the map, and then underneath wrote Lydenburg Heads. And then I turned to my father and I'm like, what are the Lydenburg Heads? And he's like, I don't know. So I continued being curious about the Lydenburg Heads, and then finally, earlier this year, around May, the 2nd of May, I looked up what is the Lydenburg Heads, and I made this whole discovery about what it is. And so I decided that I'm gonna go and view the Lydenburg Heads. So it was a solo trip that I did earlier in May. I did it after um, attending a wedding, a family wedding in Limpopo. So instead of going immediately back home after the wedding, I decided, you know what, let me take the other way and go to Lydenburg before I go home, considering that the road signs were saying that Lydenburg is 150 kilometers away from where I am. However, it was not an impulsive decision. I really had thought it out. Um, it's just that it was a decision that I made at short notice. But I had planned my itinerary. I had identified the accommodation that I was gonna live that I was gonna sleep at during this visit. So I had my ducks in the row in a row before I went. Another thing to mention is that this was my first overnight solo trip. I had done a solo trip, a couple in Cape Town. It's just that I would come back to Cape Town at the end of the day and still sleep in my own bed, right? So I wouldn't sleep far away. I'd make journeys. The longest that I'd made was one to a destination 170 kilometers away from Cape Town, and I still managed to come back to my apartment and sleep in my bed. However, with the Lydenburg, I decided that, you know what, I'm just gonna sleep at Lydenburg. Okay, cool. So, um, one of the things that I did when I got to Lydenburg was to visit the Lydenburg Museum to go see the Lydenburg Heads. And so, let's start with the Lydenburg Museum. What is it? What is it about? So as I mentioned, the Lydenburg Museum is in Lydenburg, which is a very small town, right? It doesn't take long to drive through Lydenburg. Um, and this is a small museum. The Lydenburg Museum is a very small museum. Very it's not fancy, so do not expect a fancy museum when you go there. It's very simple, very basic, but still interesting nonetheless. Right? Don't let those simple that simple description of museum deter you from going to visit the museum. And this museum is dedicated to displaying the cultural history and human heritage of the Lydenburg area. It is also situated at the entrance of the Gustav Klingblay Reserve. I hope I said that correctly. um and in this reserve you can go mountain biking, you can go hiking, can go view some wildlife, and there are also ancient petty remains that exist in there. So when you do go visit the Lydenburg Museum, you can combine that visit with um a tour of this reserve that I'm struggling to pronounce, so I'm not gonna try again to pronounce it. Um, and The entrance at the museum is free. However, the entrance to the reserve is, you do not pay no more than 30 rand. I can't say exactly what the amount is because I didn't go. I didn't know about this reserve before I arrived. So I just went straight for the museum, and I was shocked to find out that it's free. I was so excited when I learned that it's free to go into the Lydenburg Museum and view these heads. So what are the Lydenburg heads? I'm so excited to be talking about the Lydenburg heads. The Lydenburg heads are a number of heads that were made out of pottery, that are made out of clay, right? So these are heads that have humanoid features, right? One of them has like this face that looks like it's a human face, and one of them, it has like this bizarre look that is between a human and an animal. It looks like a human with an animal's snout, right? So they are very bizarre looking heads, and they are very ancient. These heads date back to the early Iron Age era, and this would be around 400, 490 AD and 500 AD. So these heads are over 1,500 years old. What? What? Yes. So they are very old. And what makes these heads significant is that they represent the earliest artwork in the southern hemisphere, right? So in southern Africa, these heads are the first evidence of art, of sculpture in the region. So that's why these heads are so important. They show the artistry that these ancient people had back then, and it's very good, right? It's very good. These To see these heads, to see these people's creativity, it's very impressive. um and these heads, they look broken. They have been assembled back together, but if you do walk around the heads, uh, and the enclosure in which they have been put in, you will see that there's certain parts of the heads that are missing. So that's how old they are. They even have missing parts. And the heads that are displayed at the Lydenburg Museum, is 3 out of the 7 heads that were found. So the heads that were found was 7 in total, and they were found by a young boy whilst he was playing on his father's farm, not far away from Lydenburg. So yeah, these are the ones. The rest of the heads, well, all of the heads are are put in at Cape Town, right? The ones that are at Lydenburg Museum are copies. They're not the original ones. They're just copies of the originals. The original ones have been stored at and displayed at Iziko South African Museum, right? It's one of those museums in Cape Town, around the God. What is it called? The what is it called? The garden. Why all of a sudden is this name eluding me? The Cape Gardens. Yes, if I remember correctly. Yes, the Cape Gardens. So the Cape Gardens is an area that has a number of museums that host a variety of things, right? Each museum has its own theme, and one of these museum is the Iziko South African museum. So if you are in Cape Town and you are listening to this from Cape Town and you're like, I want to see the Lydenburg Heads, but Lydenburg is so far, well, you have the original right next to you, not far away from you. So you can just go to a Iziko museum and view the original. How lucky are you? But if you are in the northern part of the country, well, your best option is to go to the Lydenburg Museum to view these heads. So it is believed that these heads were used during ritual ceremonies, and used by the early Iron Age people um, during ceremonies such as, the assumption is such as, ceremonies such as initiation, yeah, used during initiation schools, or used as as objects to for performance or educational storytelling, which is one of the same thing, because some rituals, right, in African culture still use performance and art, right, to execute that ritual, right? I hope that makes sense. So, it is suspected that during these ceremonies, these heads were either used as masks, or some were tied to posts, for decorative purposes. So this is the significance of the Lydenburg heads. They show us the artistry of the early Iron Age people, and they show us that rituals are something that date very far in human evolution. It's not just a recent thing, or a thing that was developed a couple of centuries ago. That this is something that dates back to the first millennium, right? So often we talk about early Iron Age, later Iron Age. So what does it mean that when we say these were early Iron Age people? So in the previous episode, I did talk about the Iron Age a bit in depth. So if you want that detailed discussion about the Iron Age, you can go back to the Mapungubwe episode, part 1, and you can listen to that information that I provide on the Iron Age. However, I do not make this distinct, or I do not distinguish between the early Iron Age and the later Iron Age. This is what I'm going to do right now. So the early Iron Age, when people say early Iron Age, this refers to the first people who brought the Iron Age to the southern region of Africa. That's what it means. The people who first came with this. So these are the people who were migrating from Central West Africa, which would be around the Niger, Congo, and Cameroon area. And these people were migrating south, right, to now Southern Africa, and in our case, South Africa. And these people were not as developed as, for example, the Mapungwe people. These people also uh, still used Stone Age tools, right? So uh, you could say that these are the people who are transitioning between the Stone Age to the Iron Age. So that's what we mean about the early Iron Age people. And they were not rich people in terms of materialistic things, and they were still a migrating group of people. Whereas with the later Iron Age, these are settled Iron Age communities. You know, these are communities that have now formed into bigger systems, more powerful and more settled systems, right? Like Mapungube, and um, they are they have grown, right? They have become empires, whereas the early Iron Age people, they were much more smaller groups, and yeah, they were just different small communities of these groups of people. So that's what we mean by the early Iron Age. And these are the people that we are referring to when we talk about the artistry that the Lydenburg Heads show that these people used to possess, right? So that is it. So I mentioned that you can find the original heads at the South African Museum, the Iziko South African Museum, and I just want to discuss the fees if you do decide to go and visit or see these heads at the South African Museum. The for adults it is 30 rand, but if you're a student with a valid student card, you can pay half price and you pay 15 rand. And pensioners also pay half price, but do bring your ID as a pensioner so that they can give you that half price. But even much more better than that, on Fridays, if you're a student or a pensioner, you enter for free, right? And that's what I used to do when I was in Cape Town. I used to just I used to designate Fridays as my museum tour day, right? So after tutoring, after doing my own academic work, I would uh, go spend the rest of the Friday visiting a museum and learning about the history and the heritage of this country. So if you are in the Cape Town area and you want to see these heads, you're welcome. It's very affordable. If you're a student, it's free. If you're a pensioner, it is free. And operating hours are Monday through to Sunday from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Isn't that amazing that you have this access every day, all week? Um, And these loans, however, though they are displayed by the Ezekiel South African Museum, they actually belong to UCT. UCT has loaned them to the Ezekiel Museum, And how did UCT get the rights of these heads when they were actually found in Lydenburg? Why does the Lydenburg local government not have the rights to to these um, to their own heritage? Well, this is because the boy who found it, he eventually went on to go study at the archaeological department of UCT, and when he was there, he eventually gave his discovery to the university, and that's how UCT eventually gained these ownership rights over this head, and that's the story behind it. Other exhibitions that you can find at the Lydenburg Museum. So the Lydenburg Heads is the main museum. So when you enter the museum at Lydenburg, it's the first thing that you're gonna see, and it's a beautiful exhibition. Uh, it's very beautiful. You have to see it for yourself. Very informative. It does also trace this migration that I was talking about, and also trace this evolution from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. So if you do go, please do engage with that text that has been put up on the wall. Do not just view the heads and then get out. There's more information, and you just have to walk around and read. And there's even much more to the museum than just the heads, the Leidenberg heads. There are more exhibitions that you're gonna engage with, and these include Pedi and Africana cultural items. Um, I was very impressed with this museum because it does a good job of really balancing these two cultures that dominated this area, or you could say still dominate this area that is Leidenburg. Because usually when you visit uh, museums, the culture that is prioritized, or the culture that is dominant, is a very European one, or one of a European um, origin, right? Whereas here, there was a very good balance of the Pedi culture and the Africana culture. And so as you walk through the museum, you're going to see different cultural items um, that give you an idea of each culture, and items such as objects that have to do with medicine, objects that have to do with food, objects that have to do with clothes, jewelry, farming tools, sports. So there's a lot that is offered there about the history of these two cultures, and it's very well balanced. Another thing that I was impressed by the Leidenburg Museum is, for the first time, I finally learned about my own culture, right? So for me, there was this void in my own knowledge about my history that my own parents could not fill, or my own father could not fill, because my father's the bedi in the family. And in African culture, it is said that a child takes on their father's culture regardless of what their mother is. um so my father is Bedi, and that's the culture that I identify with mainly. uh I do identify with other culture and recognize that they are part of me, but the dominant one I identify with is Betty. If somebody asks me what I am, I'm just gonna simply say that I am Betty, right? I'm not gonna complicate the answer by saying, "Oh yeah, there's I my mother is Sutu, but I grew up with around Xhosa people. I also have Xhosa family relatives, Zulu." It's just gonna complicate the answer, so I identify as Betty. However, I do not have you know uh, uh in-depth knowledge about my petty heritage, like where it started, what were the politics of that, how were the groups of people that lived in ancient times, what was the petty culture like back then. So um to get to this museum and learn that history, wow, I was so impressed. I walked away very, very impressed, learning about the rise and fall of the Pedi Kingdom, right? That's another thing that you're gonna learn when you get there. And I also finally understood, you know, who Mampuru was. That's one figure that I knew of, and the only reason I knew of him is that I used to live at Mampuru Correctional Services. So there is a residential area. As much as it is a prison, it's the Pretoria Central Prison. Um, and as much as there is prisons, juvenile prisons, maximum security prison, female prisons, and prisoners can, walk through the estate, especially those ones who are close to being reintegrated back into society. They work the pools, they work the tennis courts, the the restaurant that exists in the estate, the cafe, the parks, the rugby fields. It's literally a city within, or a town within a bigger city. And so I used to live there because my mom is a correctional officer, right? She works for the department for the correctional services. And so, yeah, I knew about Mampuru. I knew that the reason why that place was named Mampuru is because he was the first African person to be executed at the gallows, to be hanged, right, at that place, right? Because that's what the prison is known for. It's known for, especially during apartheid, it's known for being the place where people were executed, where activists and political fighters or leaders were executed, right? So it was so interesting to finally have that information much more elaborated on, right? And that's another thing that I want to make note of. It it made me realize how, you know, how do I say this? It made me not take for granted, the things that are around me, take for granted my country, take for granted the city that I'm in, because you don't know, you never know that how significant this place is that you're existing in. You never know until you go out of your way to learn more about it. I'm just learning as I'm growing how much literally I've been living under the shadow of history. Right here I'm talking about the fact that I lived most of my childhood at Mampuru Correctional Services, right? And so much happened there, and I only realized it after I left, right? I did realize some things while I was still there, but how significant that place is and the people that have moved through that place in history, it's only now that I'm learning it, and that makes me much more appreciate where I am and not take for granted, things that are around the corner. And with that, I just want to encourage you guys to really take notice of where you are, and engaging with your art heritage, your culture. It doesn't have to be something that you do in another part of the country or in another country. It can be something that you do just in your backyard, right? Like literally, this history was in my backyard. I learned later on that there's a gallows museum. I still don't have the courage to go because I've since learned about so many people that have been executed there. that I have some kind of attachment to them. But yeah, I've just learned about these things later on, and now I'm just like, I wish I knew more while I was still there. Not that I'll never go and visit, I will. But I think, wouldn't it have been much more nice had I just known it while I was there and taken advantage of that moment in my lifetime of being there? So, with that, guys, I just want to encourage you guys to really open your eyes, be alert of what's around you. Cultural heritage tourism is not something that is far away from you, it's something that is around you, all over you. So, if you are interested in seeing the Lydenburg Heads, in knowing more about the Lydenburg Heads, do go visit the Lydenburg Museum at Lydenburg/Mashishing, or do go visit in Cape Town if you're in the Cape Town area. This history is available around the country if you have an interest in it. And until next time, I will talk to you next week. Keep good and make good choices, and I'll talk to you in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.